So today I've decided I'm going to live a little bit of a history lesson about the Civil War, of course, because that's what I know. If you know me, I know a lot about the Civil War. It's kind of tickled my thoughts because of what's going on with all the taking down of the statues and stuff, and now it's getting even more support than ever for taking down statues from even some people that wouldn't have supported it a couple of years ago that have kind of changed their minds about it. So it got me kind of thinking as I'm reading all these people talking about what the war was really over. And one of the big fallacies of the war was that the war couldn't have been fought over slavery because Lincoln did not go to war to free the slaves. And it was up to him whether or not to free the slaves as the victorious country, I guess you would say. But see, where that's wrong is Lincoln didn't start the war. The war wasn't started when Lincoln invaded the South. The war was started when the South seceded. Why? Because at that point, it was an insurrection. It was a rebellion. They were taking federal property, the states, and forts and military equipment and saying, it's ours now, and we're leaving your government, and there's nothing you can do about it. But that's not really true, because any government worth its salt has the right to defend itself from a rebellion. So what does this mean? They're almost obligated to defend themselves. I mean, if part of your country goes into rebellion and you don't defend the country and try to stop that rebellion and crush it, then what's to stop everybody from leaving? Your strength comes from that. Your strength as a union comes from your ability to defend yourself and try to keep your country whole throughout history. Anytime there's a rebellion, obviously whoever's in charge is going to try and stop it. So Lincoln was pretty much obligated to try and keep the Union whole. And that's why he invaded the South. I do invaded because you really couldn't invade it. It was still the United States of America. The Confederate States of America never officially existed. Therefore, any Confederate states were still the United States. They were just states in rebellion. So, you have to really get to the root cause of why the South seceded. So why did they secede? Well, a lot of people want you to think it was about states' rights. That's a bunch of bullshit. You say, well, how do I know it's a bunch of bullshit? Well, because we go back to what the people said. And they didn't say it was about states' rights. The one I always point to is the state of Mississippi, when they seceded and published their documents of why they were seceding. Basically like their Declaration of Independence. They call it Declaration of Secession. In each state, not all the states, I think 6 or 7 of them out of the 11 that seceded published their own Declaration of Secession and explained why they seceded. And all of them in a roundabout way talked about slavery. But Mississippi in particular, first sentence, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Thoroughly identified. There's no states' rights issues, there was no tariffs, there was no oppression from the North. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. This is right from the mouths of the people that did it. Okay? This wasn't like some Joe Schmo in the street. So that's it. How are you going to argue with them? Well, one of the things they argue about is, well, the common Southerner didn't fight for slavery. Well, maybe not. Maybe the common Southerner didn't fight to preserve slavery. But the common Southerner didn't start the war either. So one of the arguments they use is, well, only 3% of Southerners own slaves. Well, that's an accurate number, but it's not really valid. Accurate because, sure, only 3% of Southerners own slaves, because if you own a slave, that's your property. And there's a deed, a certificate of ownership, saying that you own that slave. And just like a car or a stereo, one person owns it. Just one. It'd be like the head of the household, most likely. That one person would own a lot of slaves. In the case of, Alabama, I think, or maybe it was Mississippi. I forget off the top of my head, but there was definitely at least one state where the slave population was more than the white free man population. So what does that 3% of owners really mean? It doesn't really mean anything. Because when it gets right down to it, the whole household benefited from that slave. And even poorer farmers that didn't own big plantations but still had little farms, they still benefited from the slaves because the rich plantation owners would loan their slaves out to these smaller farmers to help them during harvest and stuff. They would loan them. And maybe they rented them, but they let these small farmers use them. So that 3%, when you're talking about the head of household that owns it, and these huge plantations where the father lived there and the mother lived there and their 10 kids, because they always had like a ton of kids, and like cousin Jeb and his mom and dad, they lived somewhere off on the plantation. Grandma and grandpa still lived there because now you were supporting them because they were elderly and you had kids running around. So you had this huge family living on this plantation. And they all benefited from the slaves, even though good old dad was the only one that actually owned the slaves. And when you bring it into households that own slaves, it actually brings the number closer to 15%. You're like, well, that's still not really a lot. In the grand scheme of things, 15% is a minority. The problem is this. That 3% and that 15%, those were the wealthiest 3% and the wealthiest 15%. They were the top cream of the crop. They had the most power and the most influence in government, if they weren't in government themselves. It's like our 1% today. What do they actually control? How much of our country does the 1% control to make it go the way they want to go through donations and the policies that they back with their big money and all that? And when they actually get into politics, some of these richer ones, like Trump, Bloomberg, and the guy in Illinois, Pritzker, one of the richest governors to ever hold public office. So the top 1% has a huge influence on government. So even back then, now you're talking 3%. If you just take the owners, we'll just take that 3% number. And yeah, but they'd be the 3% that had the most power and influence. And what did they want? They wanted slaves. So what was Lincoln's deal? Well, Lincoln wasn't going to abolish slavery. He didn't run on a platform. The abolitionists backed him up because he had the closest thing to an abolitionist ideology of any of the other people running. It was either that or I think Buchanan. Buchanan was a Southern Democrat, so he wasn't gonna. But Lincoln's main thing was he didn't want slavery to spread out west. Southerners couldn't accept that. They saw that as limiting their slavery, and they thought that if they were limited from being able to grow as the country grew out west, that eventually they would lose their slaves. And it was a perceived threat because Lincoln even said he wasn't going to end slavery. But that's how they saw it. And the wealthy landowners and the slave owners, they couldn't deal with it. They weren't going to accept that. They were the ones in charge of making the decisions. And that's what they did. They seceded. And that poor Southern guy down the road that never owned a single slave, well, somebody had to fight the war. And sure as hell wasn't going to be the rich top 1%. I mean, if it was, they were the ones that were getting generalships and stuff, becoming officers with their influence. So yeah, they still fought, but they weren't the infantry grunt down on the ground getting run over by horses and shot by Minier balls. So anyways, that's a little history. Like I said, sure, Lincoln didn't start the war to end slavery. He started the war. Well, he didn't start the war. His whole goal was to reunite the Union, keep the Union whole. But that's not what started the war. What started the war was the South seceding and the South becoming states in open rebellion. That started the war. The minute they did that, they were in open rebellion. And that was the start of the war. And they were in open rebellion to protect slavery. It's all there. It's written. They wrote it. There's no guesswork. All the states' rights and tariff stuff is trying to rewrite history. There's no guesswork in it. It's all written in plain English. You just got to know where to look. So look.